Yesterday was Independence Day, which is the day that we celebrate the birth of our country. I've always thought that July 4th was the day that the Declaration of Independence was signed, but as I did some research, I discovered that it was actually almost a month after that the signing took place. The document was actually, the rough draft of the document anyway, was actually completed on July 1st, and then it was debated for a couple of days to change the wording and get the wording that we have today. It was July 4th that the Declaration of Independence was actually voted on and approved by the Second Continental Congress. Today, I want to talk a little bit about that document and what it means to us. The Declaration of Independence in itself did nothing immediately. It didn't change anything. It was simply a declaration by our founding fathers that they were no longer going to allow England to dictate what could or could not be done in this country. It was a decision to form a new government, which would take many years to evolve. In fact, it is still evolving today. The Declaration of Independence and the war that followed purchased our freedom from English rule, which meant that as a nation, we no longer had to follow rules that were set by a king living in a continent across the ocean. But it didn't purchase complete freedom for individuals. The beauty of the new system which we created was that each person was supposed to be part of the process. Instead of having all the decisions made by a single individual or just by a committee of individuals, we were all supposed to have input into the new government which would form. It gave freedom to the nation as a whole to govern itself, but it didn't guarantee complete freedom for each individual. The reason for that is because there can be no complete freedom unless you totally live on your own and have no contact with other people. If I am totally free and I can do anything I want to do, it will likely prohibit somebody else from having complete freedom because what they want is probably going to be different than what I want. For example, if I am free to eat anything that I want, my choice of eating a particular item might keep someone else from exercising their freedom because they want that same item that I just ate. So my freedoms and somebody else's freedoms overlap. Freedom is a wonderful thing. Yet with freedom comes responsibility. You don't have the freedom to just go up and punch somebody in the nose because you feel like it. Your freedom ends where the other guy's freedom starts. True freedom is being allowed to do what you want to do at any time with no restrictions and not being forced to do something that is out of your choice. Even though we like to call our nation a free nation, there has never been a time in history where our nation or each individual in the nation has been totally free. There have always been things that are dictated to us that we must do, that if we had our choice, we may decide not to do. For instance, the draft. That is an obligatory thing that we are forced to do unless we're a conscientious objector because of religious reasons or something. Taxes. Most of us would probably choose not to pay taxes if we had a choice, but we don't. That is something we must do as citizens in the country because it keeps the country operating. Now, we could argue whether or not those tax dollars are used appropriately and all those kinds of things, but still, we are not free to choose if we want to pay taxes or how much we want to pay. That is dictated to us. So we really, although we say we're a free nation, are not totally free. Almost immediately after the Declaration of Independence was formed, immediately after we declared our freedom, we began to make rules which would dictate what choices individuals could and could not make on their own, and what involvement the new government would have in upholding and enforcing the rules that we made. The intent was to give everyone as much freedom as possible, but not allow one person's choice to keep another individual from having the same freedom to choose for themselves. The basics of those rules starts with the Constitution. And in the Constitution, we have what we call the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is supposed to guarantee us some individual freedoms, such as the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of press, etc. Periodically, additions are made to the document or clauses are added to bring better understanding to that document. Depending on where you are as an individual, where you stand, those changes, or even the Bill of Rights itself, can appear to be an improvement, or it can prove to be or seem to be a hindrance, because you may not like the wording or the interpretation of a certain one of those rights. Now, let me stop here for just a moment and talk about the difference between freedom and rights. True freedom, as I already said, is the complete absence of rules. I am the master of my own destiny, and I can do anything I want without restraints. Rights, on the other hand, are governmental legislation that tell me what I can and cannot do with my freedom, with my free choice. And rights, since they are granted by the government, can be interpreted or changed at any time. Let's look at the right to bear arms as an example. The Second Amendment gives us the right to bear arms. However, there have always been restrictions to that. If I commit a felony, that right can be taken away from me. As we have seen over the past couple of decades, the rules for how and when I can bear that arm and what kinds of arms are included in the right are up for negotiation and change. So just because I have a right to do something, it never gives me full freedom. Most of our founding fathers were devout Christians. And as they drew up the Constitution and supporting documents, they did so with a biblical worldview. However, they knew that what they were creating was not perfect and that it would only work if the nation as a whole shared that view. John Adams, one of the founding fathers, said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other." It seems like every clause of the Constitution is up for debate and interpretation now. There are people who want to throw out the whole thing and start from scratch because our nation is no longer what it was when it was founded a little over 200 years ago. Even our founding fathers knew that our Constitution was inadequate for a nation that did not have the same religious beliefs. We as believers are no longer the majority. Unless our nation once again turns to God, we will continue to see the moral and spiritual foundations erode. The answer for our country is not new legislation. It's not new government. The answer is new hearts for the people in the nation. But when the existing government appears to be violating our rights and taking our freedoms, what do? Well, the Bible actually has very good guidance in these issues. Even in the Old Testament, we have examples of how we should and should not act when laws are made which violate our beliefs or when we think our rights have been taken away. So what does the Bible teach? Respect those in authority. The Bible teaches that we should never speak evil of an authority figure, even if they are not serving God or making laws that aren't according to God's will. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established." The authorities that exist have been established by God. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17 says, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God and honor the emperor. These authorities that both Peter and Paul talked about were about as evil and ungodly as you can get. But Peter and Paul still instructed the people to honor and submit to them. Now, showing honor and submitting doesn't always mean that we obey. There are times when a human law contradicts God's law, and in times like that, we need to honor God first. However, we can disobey a human law without being disrespectful or speaking evil about someone. Let me give you a couple examples. Peter and John in Acts chapter 4 were told not to preach anymore in the name of Jesus. They answered back by saying, "Is it right for us to listen to you or to listen to God?" And then they continued to preach, which they had been told not to do. But never were they disrespectful to those authorities. What they basically said was, we know you have the authority to make any laws that you want to do, and we know that you have the power to arrest us and put us back in jail again if we violate your laws. However, we are going to do what we need to do. We are going to honor God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego disobeyed the king's decree. But again, they did it with respect, and they honored the king. They said, "Oh, king, we know that you have the power to make this rule. We know that nothing you are doing is wrong according to the laws of the land. You are doing what you have full authority to do. However, we worship a higher power, and we cannot obey your law because it violates our law, a law of our God. And we know that by not doing what you ask us to do, you have the authority to throw us into that furnace. And we are willing to take that risk. And we are willing to let you do whatever you need to do because you have the authority to do it." And of course, we know the rest of the story. They were thrown in the fiery furnace, and God rescued them for that furnace. But never did they say anything evil about the king. They recognized his position. They recognized his authority. They honored him. They simply chose respectfully to ignore and to disobey the rule that he gave. Daniel is another example. Daniel too defiled the king's decree. But once again, we see no disrespect in his defiance. In each of these cases that I just mentioned, there was a punishment for defying the order. But even then, the individuals took the punishment willingly. They didn't fight back. They didn't argue. They didn't say, "You have no right to do this." They didn't argue at that point about their rights. They simply said, "You are doing what you have the authority to do, and we're willing to take it. We know we've defied you, but we respect you, and we honor you for your position." We always like to talk about our rights and how our rights are being violated. Paul addresses that issue too. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 to 24. Paul says, "I have the right to do anything, but everything is not beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others." In another place, Paul addresses the same thing when he talks about meat that had been sacrificed to idol. There were people who believed that it was wrong, and even wrong scripturally, to eat meat that had once been offered to idols. Paul said, "I don't believe so. I don't worship those idols. To me, it's just discount meat because they would take that meat and sell it at a discount in the store." He says, "To me, it's good stewardship to eat that stuff because the idols mean absolutely nothing to me. However, I will put my right, I will even put what I believe is right and wrong according to God here. I will not stand up and argue for my rights. I will simply not do it because I don't want to offend someone else. I give up my rights for you, for the good of others. There's only one time in the Bible that I ever find anyone referring to their rights. And that's when Paul appealed to Caesar. In Acts chapter 25, verses 10 to 11, it says, Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I am guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, then no one has the right to hand me over to them, except for Caesar. So I appeal to Caesar. He used his right to appeal. He used his right to go to Caesar, but he did it all respectfully. And he said, hey, if Caesar determines I'm wrong, I will take whatever I have coming to me. But I want my right to appeal. This is a case where Paul was being falsely accused and simply wanted a fair trial. I dare anyone to find anywhere in the Bible where Christians organized a demonstration or started a riot to bring attention to their rights that were being violated. Now, before we move on, let me address the current situation that's going on right now and how it fits in with everything that we're covering so far. A lot of Christians right now are shouting about how our rights are being violated. Our freedom of religion is being taken away from us because we're not allowed to meet. Some people are even saying that we should ignore whatever the officials say and meet anyway because we need to follow God, not man. First of all, let me say that as far as I'm concerned, no one has violated or no one has tried to take my right to worship or my freedom of religion. So I don't think this is a case where I can argue my freedom, my right to worship has been taken away. I can't look at the examples that we just talked about in the Bible and try to make them apply in this current situation. I mean, Daniel was told he couldn't pray to God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were told they had to bow down to a false god. That has not happened in these situations. So we can't say we're like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We're like Daniel. We're like Paul, Peter, and John preaching when we're told not to preach. I have not been told. Nobody has told me I cannot preach. I could possibly argue that my right to assemble has been taken away from me. And that's another constitutional right that we have. But our law allows that right to be suspended during times of crisis in order to protect lives. That is a legal right that the government has to suspend lawful assembly for a period of time in order to protect lives. So really, the only valid argument that we have is whether or not the pandemic has been blown out of proportion, which none of us really has the authority to determine. We can have our opinions, but our opinions don't matter in this situation. There are other people who are authorized to make those decisions, and I may not agree with their decisions. The argument that we are being forced to disobey God because we aren't allowed to assemble according to Hebrews 10. Hebrews 10 says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. So we're being told we can't do this. We're violating God's law. That's also not a valid argument because the way we do church right now is far removed from the image of church that the Hebrew believers had when they heard those words. Nowhere in the Bible does it say we have to meet in a building to have church. Nobody has attempted to close the church during the pandemic. We've been allowed to meet online ever since day one. And at least in Washington, right now, we're also free to meet outside if we choose. The only thing we can't do right now, because we're still in phase 1 here in Yakima, is we cannot meet in the building. Nobody's telling us we can't assemble. Nobody's telling us we can't worship. Nobody's telling us we can't worship with other believers. Yes, it looks different and we don't like it, but no one has told us we cannot worship God. If anything, I feel we as the church, at least here in Washington, are being given privileges that other public venues have not been given. So I don't think that we can really claim that our rights have been violated. I think our time would be better spent continually worshiping in whatever manner we are allowed to worship during this time. And instead of fighting something that we really don't have the power to change anyway, using that time to minister to people, to serve others, which is what the Bible tells us we should be doing. Even if we do feel that our rights are being violated, let's look back at 1 Corinthians 10 again, because I think it addresses that. Verses 23 and 24 say, I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. Now, this is the part I want to key in on. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Regardless of how we may feel about whether or not this virus is real or whether or not it's as bad as it's hyped up to be, the majority of Americans and the rest of the world believe that it is. All of the regulations that have been put in place are intended to protect people. If the church defies the orders that have been given because of our desire to meet, what does that say to the rest of the world? The world would see it as selfish Christians who only think about themselves and what they want. They're willing to risk the safety of everyone else simply because they want to get together. Yes, we have faith that God can protect and that God can heal. But unfortunately, the rest of the world doesn't share that faith. And if we hope to reach them, we need to be careful that we don't push them further away by our perceived lack of faith or by our perceived lack of concern for them. Paul wrote a whole letter to the church in Galatia to address the issues of freedom and what true freedom in Christ is. He said that since we are free to choose how to act, because that's really what our freedom in Christ does. It gives us the freedom, the choice that God originally intended. He put Adam and Eve in the garden, and he didn't force them to honor him. He didn't force them to obey them. He gave them a choice. Said, this is what I'd like you to do, but you can choose. So what Christ did, the freedom he purchased for us, really gave us back the freedoms that Adam and Eve had in the beginning. We are now free to choose who we will worship. Yes, sometimes there are penalties if we defy a governmental order or something. There could be penalties for that, but really no one can force us to do anything that we don't want to do. We have freedom. So Paul said, since we are free to choose how to act, instead of using our freedom to get what we desire, we should use our freedom for two things. First, he says we should use our freedom to serve one another in love. In Galatians 5:13 and 14, he says, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. Paul used the term flesh, which is also translated in other places, human nature, carnal nature, or sinful nature. He's talking about the natural tendency that we have to only think about ourselves, because that's what the flesh says. Look out for number one. Do what you want to do. Do what feels good for you. Don't worry about how it affects anybody else. They have to worry about themselves. You worry about you. That's the fleshly nature. We are free to focus on ourselves and what we want. That is a freedom that we have. I can fight for my rights. I can fight for what I want. Or I can use that same freedom to forget about me and focus on what's best for others. Now, let me give you a couple of quick illustrations here that might help some of you. One goes back to the Second Amendment, which I referred to earlier. Because I am not a convicted felon, I have a constitutional right to carry a gun. In Washington State, I even have the right to carry it openly if I choose. Now, there are a few places where I'm not allowed to carry it, but for the most part, I can walk down the streets, or I can walk into a store with a gun strapped on my waist. That is my constitutionally protected right here in Washington. However, I choose not to carry openly because I know that some would be offended or fearful if they saw a gun on my hip or my shoulder. So I have a concealed carry permit. Sometimes I exercise my right to carry and to carry concealed. But the beauty about concealed is no one even knows that I have it. Unless I go around bragging about it saying, I have a gun, which is going to alarm people. Nobody even knows that I have it. So I am exercising my freedom, but thinking about others and how this affects them. Now, I'm not trying to criticize someone who may exercise a right to openly carry. That is a right. I'm not saying it's a sin to open carry. It's just something I have chosen to do, to be humble and to serve others and think of them before I think about myself. I will not carry openly unless I were to go hunting or something, which is different. The same thing applies, I think, in the current situation with wearing a mask. Personally, I hate wearing a mask. It's uncomfortable. It makes me lightheaded if I wear it too long. I'm not even convinced, because I've been reading both sides of the issue, I'm not even convinced myself that wearing a mask is really going to help the current situation. I think that if we simply social distanced, we would be fine. And we don't put masks on every time we have the flu. We just stay away from people. But out of my respect for others and their feelings, I have decided to wear a mask when I go into public. If I go into a store or something, because there is an order, and there are a lot of people who, even before the mask order was put in place, are fearful of anyone who does not have a mask. So, to serve them in love, I will put aside my feelings, I will put aside what I could say are my rights, and I choose to honor them by wearing a mask. The same thing could be said with traveling. Now, right now, I know most of the travel bans, at least locally or within the state, have been lifted. But during the time when there was a stay-at-home order and people were told to stay in unless it's a necessary trip, a lot of people were ignoring that and going out. And again, I'm not saying that's wrong. But what was happening was they were actually bragging about their freedom. They were loving to post their pictures. Hey, I went out and I did this, and look who I'm with. And they were posting the pictures of all the people they're hanging out with. And I actually know friendships that were destroyed because one person thought they were being totally negligent, totally putting other people at risk by doing that. And this person said, and there were arguments that started about whether you should stay home, whether you should go out. If you're going to go out, go out. But you don't have to brag about it to the world. Think about other people's feelings. That's what Paul's trying to say here. Think about how your actions, even though you may be free to choose, think about how your choice, think about how your freedom will affect someone else. And if you need to put them first, if you need to in order to show love, put your freedom up aside, or at least do it when nobody else knows you're doing it. The second thing that Paul says here that can help us is he says, walk by the Spirit. Starting in verse 16 of chapter 5, he says, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Earlier he talked about the flesh, not using our freedom to glorify the flesh. Now he's saying if we walk by the Spirit, we won't gratify those desires. For the flesh desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. Remember earlier he said, put the needs of others first. The Spirit will always put someone else first. The Spirit will always default to love. They don't want the same things. They are in conflict with each other, so that you are not to do whatever you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. It's no longer about my rights or what I'm allowed to do. It's about what should I be doing at this moment in order to love those around me. We're so concerned with what the law does or does not allow, or what we can or cannot do. Paul says, forget all that. All law is human in nature. Jesus even said that. He said the law was given because people didn't know what to do. So the law had to be set up. If we actually followed the Spirit and did what the Spirit tells us to do, there would be no need for law. All law is human in nature. You don't need any of that, Paul says. Stop listening to what the world thinks and stop trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong in your wisdom or in the wisdom of the world. Just be filled with the Holy Spirit and let the Spirit be your guide. when we're controlled by the Spirit. We lose the desire to gratify what Paul calls the desires of the flesh. All those things that are not good, even though they might be legal, they're not good. Even though they might be within our rights, the Spirit says, forget that. Do what's right in God's eyes. Do what's right for this person. And then in verses 22 to 23, he tells us what the life in the Spirit looks like. And we're all familiar with this passage. This is what we call the fruit of the Spirit. Galatians 5:22 to 23. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which is patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things, there is no law. I love that last part. Against such things, there is no law. Now think about it. No country has ever passed a law saying that people can't love each other. They might try to define what love is and what love isn't. Of course, the Bible tells us what true love is. But no country has ever passed a law saying you can't love somebody. No country has ever passed a law saying you can't be joyful. In fact, they'd like you to be joyful. You can't have peace. They'd like you to have peace. Sometimes the government's not maybe demonstrating that from the top down, but they'd like you to have peace. They'd like you to get along with them. All those things that are listed there, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. No law has ever been made to say you can't do any of those things. And when we are led by the Spirit, those are the natural outflows of a life led by the Spirit. We automatically start loving people. We start respecting them. We start being gentle towards them. Instead of worrying what we can or cannot do, or what rights we have been given, or what rights we have lost, I think the Bible's very clear. We should focus on serving one another with love and allowing the gifts of the Spirit to flow from us. Regardless of what rights we currently have or may have in the future, we will always have the freedom to live according to God's plan. Eventually, we may, like the early church and like some other nations today, face persecution, imprisonment, or even death if we follow God's law to the fullness. But we're still free to choose to follow God. No one can force us not to. We might be persecuted for it, but we can still choose to follow God. And in following God, we can choose to love those who are doing the persecuting, love those who are taking our rights away. We can still honor them. Maybe not do exactly what they told us to do because it defies another law, but do it with honor and do it with respect. That is God's way. So let us not use our freedom to be selfish and think about what we want. Instead, let's use the freedom that we have and the freedoms even that are granted to us by our Constitution. Let's use our freedoms to love and to serve other people and to put their desires, their needs above our own.